Hey everyone, back again. Alright, let us continue with Cedric Robinson's Black Marxism, covering part 2, titled The Roots of Black Radicalism. So if you're just tuning into this episode, I don't know what you're doing, go and check out part 1. You'll find it on all platforms, etc., etc., etc. Do that. You'll get the regular intro, but for now, let's jump into this. So in researching this book, obviously whenever I do a book, anything I'm unsure about, I research to death. But one of the things that I came across was some of the reactions to this book. I think there was this article in the Socialist Review or something that just tore this book to shreds, obviously, as can be the case with some quote-unquote socialists, is that they tend to not really like criticisms of Marx, interestingly enough, even though I think that Marx would have very much appreciated it. But that's just me. I never met him. But I find it just very interesting the way in which sometimes Marxists, and again, I want to make this really clear, I will defend Marx till the day I die. I very much align with Marxism. But one of the things that I find really confusing about it is the way in which it, or at least some people who really embody it, really approach criticisms of it as though they themselves are coming from a place of a completely coherent, stable, unchanging theoretical tradition, like as though Marxism is itself the settled thing without any more negotiation to go on, because that's totally false. And as far as I understand it, dialectics, or at least dialectical thinking, would not ever suggest that we've arrived at the solution. And I think that the kinds of criticisms that we find in this book, albeit I don't think everything in this book is perfect. No book is perfect. But many of the criticisms we find here, I think, are super important to inform Marxist thought and to push it forward in a way that accounts for many other kinds of oppressions and many other kinds of struggles as they relate to capitalist exploitation and imperialism and how all these things are connected, but doing so in a way that acknowledges these different experiences, which will be super important as we dig into the Black radical tradition and its opposition to Western civilization. Because really, Marxism is very much embedded within a European tradition. I was just listening to Zizek the other day because for some reason that he popped up on one of my feeds or whatever, giving one of his totally unenlightened spiels about something, essentially saying things that it is only Europe that is able to produce the kind of self-criticism that allows for something like dialectical thought to emerge. And, I could spend a long time unpacking exactly why he thinks that kind of thing, how this kind of Eurocentrism infiltrates Marxist thought, and I think ultimately is a real hindrance to Marxist thought, which is a global movement. And the insistence that it must be informed by European thought and European ideology, culture, I think is a total. I think it's a real harm to the movement. But let's jump into chapter 4 here: the process and consequences of Africa's transmutation. So Europe has obviously greatly affected African nations, even before they were nations, because of course the idea of nations is incredibly new. And this is something we're going to talk about a lot more, because within socialist thought, within Marxist circles, the question of nationalism is a contentious one, but we're going to get into that. But obviously, European colonialism has greatly affected what we know to be the African continent, which is not a homogeneous mass, despite what the colonizers believed and how they treated people within what we now know to be Africa. But even people within any of the nations that are recognized within Africa, they comprise many different cultures, many different communities, many different languages that were largely had been kind of subsumed under these national categories after colonialism, which is often one of the ways in which colonialism, even in its opposition, can actually perpetuate itself. So let me put that in other words to make it clear. Colonialism creates the conditions for people to unite in ways that maybe they hadn't in the past, across cultures, across languages, even as they are forced to adopt colonial languages and they are then given a kind of way to unite. That's not always a good thing. Now, let me put the asterisk here by saying that it is necessary to oppose colonialism that people come together, but what that often means is the disappearance of what were the people's previous cultures and identities and their regions and their spiritualities, etc., have to then be put aside in favor of one homogenous movement. Now, the thing is, with many different kinds of resistive movements, is they do not necessarily develop organically over thousands of years. They are actually the response to a kind of immediate threat. And because of that, it can produce like new cultures that kind of do not necessarily resonate with everybody and can create a new kind of alienation. And this kind of alienation is a legitimate thing to criticize, and it's a legitimate thing to acknowledge, and to oppose the idea that alienation is only found if someone is economically alienated. And so in like Frantz Fanon's work, for example, in The Wretched of the Earth, he describes the ways in which anti-colonial struggles will take on local forms. And I think he was like, he was kind of right, but also kind of wrong, in that local struggles really struggle to oppose colonialism, and it takes like broader national movements to oppose colonialism a lot of the time. And so in this case, nationalism can be extremely important for people who've been colonized, but it's also kind of a problem. Ultimately, I think, the idea of the nation, we got to move past it at some point, but I mean, who am I to say? And especially because nationalism has been extremely important for the Black radical tradition, especially in Africa. We think of examples like Algeria, Kenya, various different nations that have had these very vibrant resistive movements to colonialism that had to adopted the rhetoric and the attitudes and the ideological dispositions of nationalism to oppose colonialism. And this has been a very strong part of the Black radical tradition. And this extends well beyond Africa. It extends to so many other places. So in Africa, like I mentioned, Kenya, we have the Mau Mau in Kenya. I've covered some stuff on decolonizing the mind, in which Gugi talks about that, which I think is, if you're interested in that, you can check that out. There's also the African mutineers on Amistad. There's the revolutionaries in Haiti. There's the Niger militants. And I mean, there's so many different examples. And these kinds of resistances have not attained within broader academic circles, I think, especially historically within the West, have not been recognized as being part of a broader kind of resistive consciousness. Whereas from a Marxist angle, Marxists are very quick to recognize like workers' struggles along a broader historical economic continuum. So one of Marx's famous phrases is the story of history is this history of class struggle, or whatever the phrase is. I'm sure you know it. But with that, what he is doing is he was looking at the various kinds of worker revolts in the 19th century, he was looking at earlier records too, but the 18th and 19th centuries, and he's like, look, they belong to this longer historical teleological continuum. And here teleology refers to the progress of like history in this case. And so by locating it along this continuum, he's ascribing to it a kind of logic. He's saying that worker struggles complies with this longer historical consciousness. The same has not been recognized from the same kind of European circles about Black resistance within Africa, within the US, within Central America, within South America. Instead, at best, these have been recognized as just like local immediate struggles to an immediate threat. So it's not recognized along a broader historical continuum. And one of the reasons for that goes back to colonialism and goes back to racist treatments of Africa, of Black people, and the same can be recognized in the Orientalist treatment of the Middle East. And part of these efforts have been to erase the fact that these people have vibrant histories that are incredibly humbling in terms of scientific achievement, architectural achievement, spiritual achievement, and so on. These have been erased. And so when these kinds of resistances are abstracted away and removed from being associated with a longer historical continuum, this is continuing the legacy of erasing the history of these people and how those histories inform their own historical consciousness. And this is exactly what Robinson is getting at with the Black radical tradition as being its own system, its own approach to violence, to oppression, that has taken on many forms historically and is part of that struggle against the oppressions that those people experience, and how people, specifically workers, as urgent as it is, and it is incredibly urgent, that is just one struggle. That is just one kind of oppression that we have to account for. And these struggles extend far earlier than European colonialism. One of the things, if anyone's interested in like post-colonial studies, one of the traps to avoid is understanding indigenous people, no matter where they're being discussed or being spoken with, not to understand them always through the lens of their experience of colonialism. Because that is like, I grew up in Canada. The limited histories that I received about indigenous people within the Canadian education system always starts in like the 16th century with colonialism, as though they didn't have a history before then. There are no histories to learn, no languages to learn, nothing. The history of indigenous people starts with the history of colonialism. And what this does, even if it does try to critique colonialism, what it ends up doing is mirroring that colonialism and perpetuating it by continuing these efforts to erase these people's histories and to reduce their histories to their experiences with European colonizers. And the same is true within the Black radical tradition, is not to reduce it to just a response to European colonialism. The Black radical tradition has taken on many forms in its opposition not only to Europe, but as he'll talk about, also to, albeit with a little asterisk in recognizing the difference here, Muslim colonialism of African nations that Black people have had a long history of opposing for a long time, not exactly in the exact same ways, but this is another kind of important thing that belongs to this broader and longer Black radical tradition, or at least the expression of the opposition to those forms of colonialism. So European efforts to colonize Black people have often tried to collapse them into a single identity, making it a lot easier to dehumanize them and to justify inflicting unimaginable horror against them. And we see the same thing because, as we know, no idea can completely remove itself from the context it finds itself in. All ideas are produced within a context. Marx is no different. Marx very much harbored some of these views in his treatment and view of people in Africa. So, for example, in a letter to Annenkov, he wrote, "Without slavery, no cotton. Without cotton, no modern industry. Slavery is therefore an economic category of the highest importance." So what he's saying here, and this is very much indicative of a truly Marxist viewpoint, it's that capitalism is necessary. Moreover, the systems and the kinds of accumulation, like primitive accumulation, like the origins of capitalism, are therefore necessary as well. And these include enslavement. And so with this, Marx is saying, well, people in Africa, they're a means to an end. They're the means, and their suffering, enslavement, at unimaginable horror, is a means to a better future. And it's like, really? So we're just going to subject people to this? Like, we're going to justify these kinds of violences? And it always amazes me, because inevitably, whenever I make a comment like this, there's a bunch of people who feel like commenting and being like, you don't understand Marx or whatever. And I'm like, I think I really do. And I think that this is really messed up. And this is an idea parroted by people like Zizek, parroted by others who justify horrible violence and colonialism because of this idealism, this idea that one day things might get better. and we have to trudge through this violence. Europe has to inflict violence on the rest of the world so that one day European workers might have a better day. You know, it's like, what? That's wild. But the treatment of these places hasn't always been to satisfy economic ends. It hasn't always been for the sake of opening up trade routes or finding cheap sources of labor in terms of enslavement. So not even cheap, it's just free. Everything like this. The treatment of Africa, and I would add of the Middle East from Europe, predates colonialism, and it predates capitalism. These kinds of violences have been around for a very long time, long before capitalism. It's almost as though racism is not reducible to capitalism. And he makes a point that demands a little bit of unpacking, where he suggests that Europeans, when they first confronted people in Egypt, in places that are now known as Egypt or Turkey or Lebanon, whatever, they encountered people that were smarter than them. This was during the European quote unquote Dark Ages or the Middle Ages. And they were confronting people who were geniuses. And this instilled a kind of European inferiority that Europeans never really recovered from. And because of that, they felt the need to always try to overcome this and to compensate for it by inflicting unimaginable horror on people in Africa, on people in the Middle East. And this continues today because of this feeling of inferiority. This isn't the only reason. I'm not sitting here being this is the justification for colonialism or this is the reason for it. It's not. But Robinson identifies this to say that, look, this treatment of these people is not just about economic reasons or capitalism or anything like this. It strikes at something else within them. That is another kind of superiority, a notion of superiority that Europeans hold that isn't reducible to capitalism. So part of this would then motivate the erasure of these people's histories, be it through education, through study, through systematic erasure of various archaeological findings. For example, Israel loves to do this. Israel's funny because, it's an apartheid state, which is very funny. Yes, David, I'm sorry. I don't mean to trivialize the Israeli apartheid state. But what Israel does in its obsession to prove its history is it does all this archaeological work to try to find insignia or artifacts that it can attribute to a kind of nebulous Jewish history, which is contentious already. There's a very good reason that people who are claim to be fighting anti-Semitism, if you side note, if there's a task force put up to fight anti-Semitism in the US or anything like this, very interestingly, it tends to be populated with people who are from business programs or from science or whatever. And you don't see many people in these circles who study Judaism, people who are actually studying the history of Israel or anything like this, because those people, they do 5 minutes of research, even though they spend their careers studying this stuff. And they're actually, wait a second, I think this is all nonsense. So anyways, this is why you have the Bill Ackmans of the world who are these champions of anti-Semitism, or fighting it, I should say. And anyways, yeah. So Israel does this thing where it'll do this archaeological work and it'll find artifacts from the Ottomans. It'll find artifacts from other nations and other people, and they'll just destroy it. They'll just destroy it in an effort to erase these histories in order to kind of sell its own historical propaganda about its the legitimacy of its existence. And this erasure, these kinds of erasures, serve another strategic function in trying to reduce these people to a state of, and excuse the term, but to treat these people as though they're barbarians. And what I mean by that is a people without history, people without the organizational capacity to have history. And this would inform things like Netanyahu saying that their fight against Hamas, the legitimate resistive organization, fighting against genocidal occupiers, to brand them as the children of darkness. And darkness, the term, there's so much to unpack with that, But one of the big things is to suggest that there's nothing to be seen there with darkness, like as though these people don't have a history, they don't have any kind of historical consciousness. All they are is guided by pure, unintelligible, violent evil. But to return to the Black radical tradition, and again, like, I don't want to, it would be totally wrong to suggest that European colonialism was the only kind of colonialism to affect African nations and to affect the African continent, while there's nothing under the shadow of the moon that resembles European colonialism. There's nothing in the history of the world that resembles what the British have done. Like, nowhere on earth has anything ever that we know of ever resembled European colonialism in terms of its scope, breadth, and violence. But that is not to deny that the Black radical tradition has also fought against Arabic colonialism. Now, Arabic colonialism was different, very different from European colonialism. Enslavement within informed or by Arabic people was different insofar as there wasn't embedded within it a racialized component, not in the same way as with Europeans. It was also that, at least some of the tenets that can be found in the Quran, if it was informed by Muslim thought. But as the Quran says, and as it was actually lived as far as we know, it wasn't as racialized, and enslaved people were to be fed, clothed, and sheltered the same as their owners. Now, quote-unquote owners. This is still horrendous. And I think it was even in that same Zizek video I was watching where he's like, oh, we always criticize, I mean, this is what the hill this guy is willing to die on. He's like, we always criticize Europeans for enslavement, and we never criticize Arabic enslavement. And I'm like, wow, what a very non-historical materialist way to look at things. Like, you hear the word enslavement and you're just like, well, it's the exact same thing. It's not, but the effects are no less serious, like, it's still horrendous, but it's important to account for the difference here, I think, where it wasn't nearly as systematic or organized or violent as European colonialism, but it's still horrible. And much of this would happen between the 7th and 12th centuries because Arabic colonialism, it wasn't obsessed with erasing history either. It wasn't going in and being like trying to erase these people's histories. In a lot of cases, it still respected them. And this period also saw, very interestingly, a lot of translating into Arabic of European, African, and Asian knowledges. Because, like, unlike their European counterparts, Arabic people who were colonizing these regions weren't trying to erase these people. They were trying to understand them. They were trying to expand their knowledge. They were trying to learn from them. Still bad, but different. And so, interestingly, in the 12th and 13th centuries, Europeans had to learn about themselves and their histories within these places through Arabic translations of texts that Arabic people had been compiling in their own historical understanding of these people and Europeans, which was super interesting and is also a sign of the way in which Europe is so much indebted to Arabic people. Not a homogenous mass, but like being the area and the historical and the religious and the linguistic traditions that birthed like modern science and that informed the Greeks and that informed the Romans, etc., etc. And then there's the history of colonialism of Muslim people. Like, for example, the quote-unquote founding of Portugal, and really in like Spain, that had people who lived there were largely Muslim. They were the Moors, and they were colonized by the Europeans, Christians, who then, after taking over these places in the 15th and 16th centuries, earlier than that, but then within the 15th and 16th centuries, Portugal would begin its own colonial expeditions. What you see is this kind of parasitic European logic, having no like limits, just capturing places and then using those places to capture more places. And so Portugal and Spain would be these kind of hotbeds, these focal points of, or these nexus of European colonialism. And it would extend into many different places. And it would begin from here in the 15th and 16th centuries, its own conquest of Africa. And this was all before, like we're talking about the 15th and 16th centuries here, like before capitalism, before the establishment of a bourgeois class, before the creation of a middle or of a working class that would demand more and more resources that would need to be found outside of national borders. None of that. Yet this kind of violence was occurring in the form of colonialism. And so black folks within these places, within many African nations, would be opposing Arabic colonialism from the 7th century, like 1,000 years before capitalism. And these are the kind of historical continuum, the historical consciousness of the black radical tradition in opposing that, in opposing these kinds of violences. And it's not reducible to economic conditions or to economic consciousness. And that puts us here into chapter 5, the African slave trade and African labor. So Portugal would perform a key role for the Atlantic slave trade and colonialism of Africa. No one really knows why, though. It's a historical, tricky thing, why these places were obsessed with colonizing. Likely it's a number of different reasons. They wanted to extend Christian influence. They wanted to steal resources. They wanted to steal people. They wanted to steal knowledge. They wanted to expand, early ideas of national interest and national influence into these places. All of these things could play some part, but no one really knows. Was there an increase in population? There could have been an increase in military that was just sitting idle and needed some justification to use, lack of food. Who knows? It could be a bunch of different things. It is not reducible then to just economic demand or to bourgeois desire. So in the case of the quote-unquote Americas, when Columbus arrived to colonize them, he wasn't just propelled, he wasn't just pushed or motivated by capitalist interest, but by, in Robinson's words, feudal authority and privilege commingled with the appetites of emergent merchant capitalism, national ambitions, and missionary compulsions. All of these factors, they played a part, capitalism being one of them, economic interest being one of them, but not all of them. And it's important to kind of take this within a broader historical materialist mind frame by just looking at the actual interests that motivated these kinds of violences. Because the people who would then experience it, indigenous peoples all throughout the Americas, quote-unquote Americas, would be victim to this. They weren't sitting there being like, oh, we have to attain class consciousness to oppose capitalism. They're like, we have to fight against these European Christian colonizers that are trying to convert us and take our land and steal our culture and erase our culture. Those are the stakes. That's what they're fighting against. But the slave trade would prove instrumental. It would be so necessary for overturning the European aristocracy and for establishing, setting the base for capitalism. So, granted, there's a lot here that's kind of hard to cover just because it's so historically dense, and with this kind of platform and through this kind of medium of podcasting, I think it would be it wouldn't be the greatest if I just sat here now and I listed off facts that occurred for the next 15 minutes. That would be rough. You really have to read this, familiarize yourself with the Atlantic slave trade. I think that I've covered it in a number of different texts. One of the texts I would really recommend that I've covered, but you should read it, is Paul Gilroy's The Black Atlantic. So you can go and listen to what I've done on that. But of course, it's an absolutely violent and virulent history, and it would set the base, the foundation for what we understand capitalism to be today. And the idea that capitalism would emerge from enslavement really reveals the urgency of the black radical tradition, because the history of capitalism is bound up with anti-black racism and colonialism. But we must ask, is it that the oppression of black people would then allow for the creation of capitalism to emerge? From this, we have to ask, why? Why black people in this case? And why, and he'll talk about this as well, why, for example, Irish people? And in both of those cases, he says that the logic of race as an organizational category, because it doesn't really exist, and I'll unpack it in a moment, because I know this is This is something people say, and they're right, but they'll say like things like race doesn't exist without explaining why. And if you're not familiar with the idea, that could maybe be a little bit jarring, so I'll explain it. But like the very idea of racial distinction had to exist before these kinds of exploitations would occur. So that shows us that there was already a racist inclination and racist attitudes and racist violences before capitalism, because it was these racial distinctions that the kind of early capitalist logic would cling on to, which already implies that these oppressions were already there, cling on to then justify who it would steal, who would extract surplus value from, and so on. Now, to say that race doesn't exist, what I mean by that, and what people have come to show, is that race, as far as an organizational category goes, has no bearing upon how people actually exist in the world. So, for example, like white people. What is the unifying factor of somebody being white, or two people being white? What unites them by virtue of that? That is, do you think that you're the exact same as somebody who, if you're white, as somebody else who is white? Why do we not do the same thing with like color hair or with eye color? Like, of course, people are, obviously recognized in terms of their hair color or eye color, but we do not organize them in these ways. We don't organize people on the basis of like height in these ways. So why this one category then, race, is used as a means to organize people and to place them into these recognizable bubbles. And of course, as soon as you kind of start to unpack that and you think like, yeah, of course, what actually is common among people who are clumped within a race, and you find out that there's nothing, because within, for example, Africa, where the recognition of blackness was just kind of imposed on them by European colonizers, what you had there were thousands of different peoples, cultures, religions, languages, that were all of a sudden being told you're all the same because of this racial category. Like, and just apply the exact same thing. If the tables had been turned, and it was, this of course would never have happened, but colonialism of Europe, if suddenly before Europeans had a racial category of whiteness, if all of a sudden people who are in France and now recognized as France and Germany are suddenly being told they're all the exact same and being loaded onto ships, forced to be like the same and together, even though they don't share anything in common. And it is that very recognition of their race that is used to justify their enslavement. So the idea of race emerged to justify who was worthy of violence and who was worthy of inflicting violence. It has nothing to do with actually describing any kind of differences that are the exact same across an entire people. Like, that doesn't exist at all. And then there's more to this history, like how enslavement would continue. The category of whiteness within the United States would be a way by which to distinguish, especially as enslavement, quote unquote, ended. White people needed to establish and to solidify within law distinctions between themselves and people who they viewed to be as subordinate to them or being lesser than them. And so the category of race was useful in that context, in a legal sense as well, political and legal sense. Oh, and one more thing, and this is also a point from someone like Homi Bhabha, where he writes about the ways in which through colonialism, there's an inevitable amount of like cultural exchange that occurs. When colonized people started to take on European religion, no matter where it was, and there's these histories can be traced all over the place, be it in what is now Mexico, in various different African nations, we can see the same kind of history where colonized people begin to adopt European religion and language and everything like this. Europeans started to be like, wait a second, you mean y'all are claiming to worship the same God? Does that mean we're all going to go to the same heaven? And they're like, whoa. That's not what we had in mind. We have to now make it really clear in the eyes of the world and therefore in the eyes of God that you are a separate people. And so there's that great, I'm just taking this from Baldwin, but the Malcolm X quote where Malcolm X is like, The most segregated moment in America, or the most segregated time in America, is high noon on Sunday. That is at church on Sundays. And his point is to say, like, religion has been a site of segregation. And this is one of the attributes of colonialism, in that it started to impose this kind of segregation on these people in the creation of the category and the enforcement of the category of race to maintain the racial purity of European cultures and religions and languages, etc. We see the same thing with like linguistic politics with like France or Quebec here where I am, where there's this effort to maintain that like French is a European language. Like, not in Quebec, of course, it's not in Europe, but like French is a European language. And so the French are actually kind of spooked about the fact that that's actually not true anymore, where French is more spoken in other places in the world, in many different African nations, for example, and not in France. And this means that the French no longer have a kind of monopoly over their own language, which spooks them because they want to associate it, they want it to be gate-kept, held within white Europe, not to be an African language, which is like, of course, they want French to still be the language of Molière, not to be the language of Nazibani or any other French writers or playwrights or anything like that. Like, it's about maintaining the linguistic purity and its association with whiteness. That puts us here into chapter 6, the historical archaeology of the Black radical tradition. So racist justifications for enslavement would often take for granted the inhumanity of Black people, to say that they are not human and therefore they are deserving of or primed for this kind of work. And these are often the ways in which enslaved people were likened to animals or to working animals in order to, justify inflicting this kind of violence against them. And I think that this is like only part of the equation. And I think that this is like, this kind of trivializes and defangs just how violent Europeans are, where they actually, I don't think, always needed to associate these people with animals to justify this kind of violence, because I think they would recognize them even in their humanity at times and still be like, you are not deserving of any kind of reasonable life or your own culture or anything, which is like the really horrifying part of this. But while this is like a really, obviously these are all extremely racist myths and efforts to normalize, naturalize, and justify enslavement and colonialism, like these kind of ideas have endured in other ways. That Black people just like, and this is often how enslavement is described, where Europeans arrived, enslaved all these people, and what is erased here is the exercises, is the practices of the Black radical tradition in the forms of resistance that occurred as Europeans arrived within African nations or on the shores of African nations, where it wasn't as though people there were like, yep, we're going to do this. Of course they were fighting back, but these histories are ignored. And then wherever they were taken, the kinds of resistances that the people would mount there. And this is what is often intolerable to colonizers, is like, the thought of resistance is always intolerable. Like Hamas, for example, in response to Israeli occupation and violence and genocide and colonialism, Israel's violence is totally normalized, totally fine. Any amount of resistance, regardless of its relative peacefulness, is always going to be seen as more unacceptable than state-powered, mandated, accepted violence. But in ignoring and erasing the many kinds of, and we're going to get into them, but the many kinds of resistances that Black people mounted against colonialism, what that does in a racist way is it communicates the idea that the only reason like enslavement ended, or any kind of real resistance to enslavement ended, was because of like Lincoln, a white dude. It's because of, the good feeling white people came to the rescue and saved these people. It's like, no, that is the wrong way to think about this. Absolutely the wrong way to think about this. Thinking about that is only possible by systematically erasing the vibrant histories of resistance that these people had been enacting and living long before. So then again, Zizek. Zizek is just easy because Zizek is a good embodiment of a really uneducated Marxist perspective. So it's like, it's not really representative, but still it's like, it's pretty uncritical and naive. And so it makes it easy to really caricature in this way. But like Zizek says, just flat out, he's like, yeah, the only people who were opposed to enslavement were the communists. And it's like, I'm sorry. I think the people who were the most opposed to enslavement were black people. And I think that they weren't doing so with this idea that they wanted to be communists at the end of the day. In fact, many of them were doing so in order to enter into a capitalist system in the North, within the north of the U.S. Not all of them, of course. A lot more nuance needs to happen here. But they were doing so not with communism on their minds. They were fighting against enslavement with ending enslavement on their minds, whatever was going to be after it. And to say that they were just guided by communist ideals, which is not what Zizek is saying. Zizek is not saying that. He's essentially saying these people were uneducated and unorganized and incapable of resistance because they lacked this historical consciousness, as Zizek in his racist way would say. But instead, he's suggesting that it was only the white communists that allowed for enslavement to end. Totally erasing the contributions of Frederick Douglass or Harriet Tubman or anybody else who was so instrumental in elevating consciousness and speaking to this black radical tradition and motivating these kinds of resistances against enslavement. So black people were joining indigenous resistance groups. They were destroying crops. They were self-harming in cases so that they couldn't work. They were fleeing. They were organizing and staging revolts. There was efforts to cooperate with different governments, like with the Spanish, which is not good. Obviously, it's not great, but like people in like Louisiana, newly quote unquote freed people, or people that were still enslaved, were cooperating with the Spanish in order to oppose American colonialism and American violence. They were also coordinating with religious authorities, like some components of the Catholic Church, especially some of its Spanish adherents, were opposed to colonialism, and so they were aligning with that. And all of this is a sign of this vibrant historical capacity for resistance and organization that is different and not attached to European ideas of criticism and of action. And these resistances were not themselves all homogenous. When we speak of the black radical tradition, I think it would be really wrong to suggest that it itself is this homogenous thing. It looked totally different in different places. Totally different. And I think it's really important to maintain that. So in the case of like Haiti, for example, the Haitian Revolution, which is often the case of Haiti is like, it really illustrates this well. If you look at the history of this and how it's told by Europeans, how they say it is that Haitians learned about the French ideals of freedom, liberty, and equality. And they're like, wow, that's amazing. We should oppose our enslavement because we've just learned about this. And I'm not going to sit here and pretend as though that didn't have some kind of effect. I don't know. There may have been people within the Haitian Revolution that were just like, that is what woke them up to this. But to suggest that the only way these people attained the historical consciousness to recognize that their enslavement was bad was because they saw, I wanted to swear there, but they saw the bleep motto, French motto, like that is what woke them up. What that is a perfect example of European exceptionalism and the idea that the only way these people could have opposed their enslavement was by learning about Europe. Like, that's so violent. But this is how it's often told. But in that case, one of the interesting things that happened as well was the development of the Maroon systems or Maroon settlements, where black people essentially just like withdrew themselves from colonial society and like established their own settlements and communities that were isolated from those people in the case of the Maroons. And the Maroons weren't found everywhere. Like they were these isolated settlements that were they were kind of expression of black nationalism without the size of nations or power of nations, which is important, and we'll put a little asterisk on it. We'll talk about that more in the next episode. But it was a kind of expression of black nationalism, and we saw the same thing in there were some in Jamaica, and I don't know if Brazil. I don't think Brazil really had them. They may have, but in Jamaica. Then in other contexts, there's so many examples of like guerrilla warfare, other kinds of resistances, and the term guerrilla warfare is often just is a term attributed to non-state kinds of resistances, which is I don't know, I feel lukewarm about the term, but it's in any case, it's like a kind of resistance that people are forced to adopt when they don't have militaries on their side, and it's given this kind of stylized term, and like guerrilla warfare. But there's a case of the Tempati rebellion, and any amount of them. Then there's a case of African Muslim revolt in Brazil in the early 19th century, and this saw influences from the Yoruba, for example, and various different African Muslim legacies, all speaking to a black radical tradition, or black radical traditions, I should say, that aren't homogenous. Like these would comply with, in Brazil, like the Mali revolt, and other kinds of resistances that were like very legitimate and inspired from different histories, but what unites them is being part of this black radical tradition, even if they look wildly different. And all of these resistances, they didn't just emerge in response to exploited wage labor, as the Marxist idea would have it, that, it's only when workers are put in a properly industrialized setting where sorry, you might hear my cat playing with something. Only when workers are in a properly industrialized setting where they can attain class consciousness that they can then resist. None of these people had that. Instead, as Robinson says, they were opposing sharecropping, peonage, tenant farming, forced labor, penal labor, modern peasantry, none of which was wage labor. It's almost as though these people don't need or didn't need to follow the Marxist idea that it is only with capitalism, is only with this stage of consciousness that people can revolt. Now, yes, I think a Marxist would respond, and I think they might have a little bit of a point, to be like, Marx isn't saying that it's only when at this stage that people are capable of revolt. Go back to that famous Marxist dictum. It's like the history of the world is the class warfare, or whatever the thing is. So he's like, Marx recognizes that these kinds of resistances have occurred all over the place, and they've been largely motivated by exploitation, be it enslavement, be it feudalism, etc. But still, what we're describing here are not always just responses to the economic conditions they're put in. It's against also these impositions of sexism, like in the case of chattel slavery, like Angela Davis writes about, in the opposition to just to racism generally, and to anything else like that isn't just reducible to the economic kinds of resistance of oppressions. Putting us here into chapter 7, the nature of the black radical tradition. So what is common in the records is that black methods of resistance have never taken on mass violence, like really ever. In Jamaica, uprisings of hundreds of thousands of black people, like taking to the streets, fighting against their oppressors, only a few white people died. Like, these were huge revolts revolting against enslavement and colonialism, where there's a good justification to inflict violence. And with that, there were only a few deaths. And this is often how, if you think about things like decolonialism and land back through the lens of European violence, Europeans are spooked by it because they think that indigenous peoples will adopt the same methods that Europeans do. Where Europeans just they're just murderous rampage people, and they assume that of others, that others are going to do the same thing, when that has never been the case. Never. Like, never. Like, the same with Israel. Like, I mean, Israel is just like its perfect demonstration of this. It is the absolute continuation of European colonialism, of American imperialism, and so on. Like, we see that where it's like Israel can scream all day about the possibility, about this fantasy of them being oppressed by all of the Arab nations around it, and violence being inflicted on them as they're bombing children to death every single day and massacring people seeking aid every single day. And Israelis still have the gall to be like, we are the victims in all of this. And it's like, yeah, this totally checks out within the history of colonialism. Like, this is a textbook colonial attitude that the colonizers, in inflicting violence, do so out of this like faint idea that they're protecting themselves, or like if they weren't inflicting the violence, then somebody else would be inflicting the violence against them. Totally parasitical colonial attitude. But the black radical tradition has never been a historically violent one. Now, in any case where there is a kind of resistance where a white colonizer is killed, this is then blown out of proportion. It is then made, get all the news. Like a single Israeli death is given way more coverage in the news than 50,000, 60,000 Palestinian deaths. Like, it just is. And this is such a sign of the different valuations of life. How colonialism and how racism influence public perceptions, and you have entire media industries really cultivating and manufacturing consent for this, in viewing some people's lives as being less worth living. So all of this with like the black radical tradition, in his words, this was a revolutionary consciousness that proceeded from the whole historical experience of black people and not merely from the social formations of capitalist slavery or the relations of production of colonialism. After all, he continues, it had been as an emergent African people and not as slaves that black men and women had opposed enslavement. And it understands that the power of the people far exceeds the power of tanks and missiles. And indeed, we see that with again, like, it's not the black radical tradition, obviously, but I think it speaks to another kind of human condition and a human tradition to oppose oppression. Like in the case of Hamas, in the case of Islamic Jihad, in opposing Israeli violence and other groups, it's like they know full well that the strength of the people far exceeds the strength of weapons. Weapons, I mean, they're important and people need them to fight against their oppressors, not denying that. But what the black radical tradition acknowledges and what other resistive logics and traditions acknowledge is that no amount of oppression can truly crush a people, because a people will always win. I mean, this is kind of, it's a little bit, easy for me to say, obviously, sitting comfortably in a place where I'm not under constant threat. But this is what Robinson is getting at. And this is what the people are opposing, these kinds of violences. And they know full well that they have the power. There's another great quote from Malcolm X where he's like, never let your oppressor tell you how much power you have. And it's a very powerful quote. And I think it really captures the essence of the black radical tradition as being one that recognizes the power of the people in these cases. And yeah, that'll wrap up part 2. Next time we're going to get into part 3, titled Black Radicalism and Marxist Theory, and we'll finish off this book. And yeah, I hope that you enjoyed what we're at so far. If there's anything I got wrong, anything I should have said differently or anything, please let me know. I'd love to learn from you if you're willing to put in the labor. But yeah, hope you liked it. If you did, I don't know, tell your friends. They might get a kick out of it. And on that note, catch you next time. Take care.